Welcome to Innovations in Education. I'm your host, David Adams, CEO of the Urban Assembly. And on this show, we bring guests every single episode who have made things work in public education. This show is about the innovators. This show is about the folks who are solving problems. This show is about making things work in education. Now, there's a lot of shows out there talking about what's wrong in the education systems, and those are great shows. There's some shows talking about what we're not doing well, and there's a lot to learn from those, but that's not this show. This show is going to be featuring educators who are making things work for young people and improving public education. Today on Innovations in Education, I am honored to welcome two extraordinary leaders in experiential and equitable schooling, Richard Stopol and Laurie Adams. No relation. Now, Richard is the founding force between New York City Outward Bound Schools, having led the organizations since its inception in 1989. And an attorney by training, Richard, you brought a deep commitment to educational equity and the belief in the transformational power of challenge, community, and learning outside the traditional classroom. Under your leadership, the organization grew from a modest start into a network serving tens and thousands of students across New York City, bringing together rigorous academics, character development, and experiential learning. Richard, welcome to the show.
Pleasure to be here, David. Thanks for inviting me and Laurie.
No problem. Joining you is Laurie Adams, the newly appointed CEO of New York City Outward Bound, who brings more than 2 decades of international leadership in education, youth development, and social justice to the role. Laurie, before stepping into this position, you led Women for Women International, expanding its footprint globally and deepening its work around empowerment and equity. Your own transformative experience on an Outward Bound trip has shaped how you view mission-driven leadership. And now you bring that vision to Richard's ideas in the everyday lives of students and schools. Laurie, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much, David. It's an honor.
Now, Richard, before we get into the conversation about your new book, I just want to compliment Laurie on your last name. It's a great name. I was traveling down my town with my kid last night. I saw Adams Avenue. We all decided that was the best street in Union, New Jersey. So I just want to give you a shout out for whoever gave you that position in terms of your last name.
It was apparently as my Slovakian ancestors were coming across just 2 generations ago. And they said, Adamsek, that's not a very American name. We're going to change that to Adams. So that's the story. An immigrant family being Americanized sometimes is not always to your will, but that's part of our history.
Well, that is the history that we could appreciate. And it's good to be in community with that history and our last names together. Richard, we're actually really excited to have you on today because you're not just the former CEO of New York City Outward Bound, you're an author. Can you tell me a little bit about your new book? What made you write it? What central themes came to the forefront that made you think this is the time to tell my story? Richard.
Actually, just before jumping into the book, I want to thank you for providing a blurb for the book, which I deeply appreciate and means a great deal to me. It really does.
Well, it was a great book. I mean, I hate to speak on it on your behalf, but since you said hello for it, it was a reflective book. It was talking about your experiences growing up, your experiences with your wife, your experiences in community with others. It was one of those books that made me just stop and think that I thought I knew you, but now I know you better for having taken an opportunity to read that book and create some insights. So it was a pleasure to write it, and it was a pleasure to read it.
Yeah, no, thank you for saying that. I want to make one other connection to the book to you, which is one of the essays in the book is about Greg Farrell, who I write as a visionary mentor and was a mentor to me and was one of the founders of New York City Outward Bound Schools and EL Education. And your listeners may not know this, but David was the recipient of the Greg Farrell Award a couple of years ago, which we established to honor Greg's legacy. And the legacy was encapsulated in the tagline of lighting sparks, living boldly, and leaving the world a better place. I think that's a wonderful description of you, David.
Thank you, Richard. I will say I keep that spoon in my living room. My children ask me about it, and I explain it to them, and they're like, I don't get it. It's a spoon. I'm like, it's more than a spoon. You'll figure it out one day as you get older.
For another time, the explanation of the spoon. But anyway, as to the book, so the title of the book is Inward and Outward, Reflections on Education, Democracy, and the Human Spirit. And I wrote the book because I had always used writing as a way of thinking through issues and topics of import to me. and expressing my thinking on those issues. And, when I was the CEO of New York City Outward Bound Schools, I had kind of a platform to share my thinking and writing. And then when I stepped down, I didn't really want to lose my voice as someone who weighed in on those things. And so when I retired, I was contemplating writing a book on leadership.
Mm.
Not because I think I was the most wonderful leader in the world and had a lot to say about my own leadership, but that I'd been privileged to work with so many great leaders whose lessons I wanted to share. But then I realized I had this trove of essays that I had written over the years. Some of them got incorporated in a first book that I had written called Education the Outward Bound Way. And anyway, I felt like I had something to say through the essays that I had collected, some of which had been published, but many had not. And that became this idea for, well, let's put them together in a book. And part of the putting together of the book, the process was culling those essays to try to come up with the ones that I thought spoke most to people. And the kind of central ideas or themes really align very nicely around education and what can and should education look like in today's world. Then there's a section on democracy, and it's called Lessons Beyond the Classroom, but it's a lot about my reflections on the state of our democracy, its fragility and the threats to it, but also things I think we can and should do to preserve our democracy, including things that we can and should do as educators. And then the last section, you kind of alluded to it, there's the personal section. That's a lot about individuals, my mother and others.
Yeah, I remember.
Who I am. And
Yeah.
while everybody will have their own people and events that shape their lives, I hope that some of my stories resonate and speak to people and have some familiarity to them. So that's the book.
Well, it was a remarkable book, and I want to take a second to bring us back to this notion of New York City Outward Bound. When I introduce you both, you are both CEOs or former CEOs of New York City Outward Bound Schools. But tell me what that means. And maybe, Laurie, since you are new to the role, what does it mean to be the CEO of New York City Outward Bound Schools? What is New York City Outward Bound?
Well, it's just such an honor to lead this fabulous organization. And it was founded with the question, how can we bring the beautiful experience of an outward bound course, which people mostly know as being in the out of doors for a couple of weeks, how can we bring that beautiful experience of growth through challenge with support into the New York City classroom and make it available to the largest education system in the United States? And that ethos of challenge with support, of adventurous learning, daring exploration, real world engagement, meaningful challenge with support is what brought me to the school and what we do. Now, New York City Outward Bound Schools is both Outward Bound calls itself a school in the out of doors, but we also work in over 100 schools in New York City now.
Wow.
And there are 14 schools which bear Outward Bound in their name, just as Urban Assembly has names. And so it has layers.
Like a parfait,
The 100 schools that we now bring that approach to through CREW, which I'm sure Richard will talk about, and us being part of a larger outward bound movement that sees outdoor education and bringing that to more students as a founding part of our mission.
Laurie, I appreciate that so much. So it sounds like you said a couple of things. You said that Outward Bound feels like a school in its approach to making sure that folks are learning through challenge, but you also have schools as part of your inner parfait. I'm gonna extend this analogy, but I don't know how a parfait works, so I'm gonna go that far. But then you also have schools that have Outward Bound as their design principle that you guys may have started, or did you organize? And then you have schools that you support. Can you just walk us through those layers one more time?
Well, one of Richard's chapters is actually about starting a school. And School Without Walls is the most recent school, I believe, that we were partners in starting. And it's unique in that it is both a distance school and an in-person school. And so, yes, we were part of the small school movement. And yes, we were partners to many in founding schools, but also schools that are attracted to the adventurous learning approach that we take, both through instruction, through deeper learning, and through our CREW methodology, can ask to join our core network. But you can also, and this is one of Richard's legacies, with Rita Joseph, the speaker, and with the support of city council members and the Department of Education, we now have this CREW, and it comes from the phrase crew, not passengers, which is how do we provide students a place of belonging? And so for a class a day, sometimes every day, sometimes 3 days a week, in over 70 schools in the city. Students are coming together, and through a crew advisor that is trained by ourselves through our professional development program, is given an experience of who am I? Who am I with this group? It's a home base that makes students learn more about equity, learn more about belonging, and have a safe space. And the survey results we just had, that over 94% of students surveyed said, yes, I feel I can trust my crew advisor. And that's really important, that students have a trusted adult in this place of deep mental health crisis and all kinds of challenges that our students are facing, but also that they have each other as peers. And we had two speakers at our gala in May, both of whom spoke. Joseph Chavez spoke from Validus, which was one of the original schools, and he just said how at the moment when he felt most lost, it was that home base, that crew, that made him feel like he belonged. And it was the Crew Olympics. This is when all the different schools competed against each other in a sort of, a fun, interactive way of competing, but mostly competing against themselves, actually, that he felt like that sense of joy and competition and belonging is what made him feel at home and safe and believing in himself.
Just to build on what Laurie was saying, and this will be very familiar to you as someone who runs an education not-for-profit, is I think what Laurie was describing is this kind of mix of breadth and depth strategies, all with the idea of how can we as an organization in this larger educational ecosystem have the most impact on the city's school system and on its young people. And so the schools where we have kind of multiple touch points, where we're trying to bring Outward Bound to life in multiple ways, that's the depth approach. And then the crew schools are really the breadth approach. There's an essay in the book, Crew in Every School. I think every school would benefit from having crew. Not every school maybe is ready to implement crew, and there'd have to be some conditions that they'd have to meet. Mostly what Laurie described, they'd have to be really committed to bringing to life this ethos of we are crew, not passengers. But anyway, it's this real mix of breadth and depth strategies, all with the aim of having the greatest impact on the city's.
Well, I want to elevate that idea because part of your book talks about the nature of democracy. Part of your book talks about education and what we need to be doing in our education system. And these seem to be related to this notion of belonging, this notion of crew. Richard, I want to get back to that question around the relationship of your leadership of Outward Bound and how you organize your book, and what did you see as what educators should be doing that reflects some of these philosophies around adventurous education and crew, not passengers?
Yeah, and I think there's a really strong linkage between the education and democracy pieces of the book. I think Crew Not Passengers is not only an ethos that we're trying to establish in schools, it's what I hope is a metaphor for our entire country, that we try to create a national ethos where we think of ourselves as looking after, taking care of one another. And maybe that sounds naive at this moment, but it's an aspiration. And so I think it's a really useful metaphor of how we can think about overcoming so many of the divisions that currently exist in this country. I also would say that part of the Crew Not Passengers quote comes from Kurt Hahn, who was the founder of Outward Bound, a German educator. And my book, maybe to excess, is studded with quotes from Kurt Hahn. But, one of the things that Kurt Hahn in his schools really emphasized, the Kurt Hahn story is that he had to leave Germany because he was leading a school during the rise of Nazism. And he wrote a letter to the alumni of his school saying, we need to stand up against Nazism. So threaded throughout Outward Bound, part of our DNA is this idea of standing up for what you believe, standing up against injustice in particular, and leaving the world a better place. So there's a lot in the book of this idea of standing up for what you believe, fighting against injustice, that we as educators not only have an obligation to do that ourselves, but to impart that kind of ethos in the young people that we work with and kind of activate them to be not just informed citizens. One of the most important things we can do as educators is prepare our young people to be good citizens. That means being informed on the issues. It also means being civically active and responsible.
How are we doing, folks? How well are we living those values out? How do we feel about our current civic state in terms of preparing young people to stand up for what's right?
Look, we live in a very divided country. I sometimes use that these are challenging times, but I think they're more than challenging times. They're perilous times. And yet, and Laurie is more, and you too, David, are more current on this because you spend more time in schools and with young people. Whenever I encounter young people, certainly in our schools, I feel tremendously hopeful. And Laurie was talking about listening to the young people who spoke at our gala. It goes well beyond the gala. Our kids are, I think, really highly motivated to make a difference in the world. So I feel hopeful about it.
Laurie, where are you at with this? Making sure we have informed citizens of character, making sure that they're crew, not passengers.
I think it's riskier and riskier to stand up for what you believe in right now. And that is something that Black and brown people, that LGBTI people, that many people in our country have faced all along and have understood the necessity for collective power and for, a real resilience and forte. And I think that this support that we give to students in believing in themselves and understanding what they believe and making the case for it is really important. But we can't underplay how risky it is. For example, in thinking about this podcast, I was even wondering whether to share. So I won't share the school or the name, but I was in one classroom where the question was, what is the biggest highlight of the year for you? And a young woman said, when ICE came to my neighborhood and I knew that my crew would stand by me. And, it just tore at your heart. The kinds of challenges that students are facing. And yet we need students who are willing to stand up for what they believe in. One of Richard's essays is about decency and respect, not in violent ways. I heard this story, and I can't remember if I read it or someone told me it, but it was very recent. And it was a student who graduated last year in May. And they said, are you so proud that you graduated high school? And the student said, I'm glad I made it through alive. And that's because of the epidemic of shootings and violence that we see across our classrooms. And I'm recent to the United States. I moved here 10 years ago. And it's something you don't see anywhere else in the world. And it goes all the way back to the days of, churches being bombed in the anti-civil rights movement. So the courage to be able to, and the skills to be able to debate issues. We will have differing views, but to debate them and to debate them with civility and respect for each other is critically important. And I do think that the link is not, what we do in the classroom is really important. Out in nature is also really important. I read a study yesterday that literally says that your cortisol levels go down when you're outside. And that the fact that our children are staying on their screens after school and at home, not running around outside like I did when I was growing up, literally increases the agro level, right? Your cortisol levels, which is your stress hormone, which is your agro hormone. So it's like getting outside, giving a sense of belonging and safety, and having literally courses. Our instruction for deeper learning, project-based learning, is about how do you engage on these challenging issues, whether it's climate change or the council budget. Part of what our students do in our schools is literally do field trips, such as go lobby on the budget. So actively learning how to engage, but then having a support base where you feel safe even across difference is fundamental. We mustn't put saving our planet on our children. But part of why I came to this work is, now in my 60th year, really wanting to give everything I can to supporting young people to navigate the times that we have created. And I think New York City Outward Bound Schools does that beautifully, both by getting young people in the out of doors, getting them into consistent community with each other across groups that they would not necessarily have chosen. When you get put in a crew in your school, this isn't your handpicked 15 friends. This is a group of, and our schools are designed to have diversity and to bring out diversity. So across sometimes differences, learning how to be in community together.
And Ted, the thing that I would add to that, I hope I'm not coming across as underplaying the risks that exist out there for all of us, in particular our young people. But a part of the outward bound pedagogy is this idea of, it's not a word I usually love, empowerment, of giving power to students,
Mhm.
truly putting students at the center and giving them real responsibility, having them discover themselves that they have real power. Apologies for again invoking Kurt Hahn, but there's a quote of his that I just love, which was, "Give the children tasks which, if negligently performed, will wreck the ship of state." Like give them real responsibility. And I think in the outward bound context, whether that's on our courses out in nature or in schools, we say to young people, we're asking you to really step up and take real responsibility and learn what that looks like and that you have real power to make a difference in this world.
Well, I want to stick with you on this, Richard, because we talked about responsibility and this notion of empowerment. And as you were writing this book, I want to elevate, like, what were the things that surprised you about your own writing process? If you could take a meta view of yourself writing this book,
Yeah.
what are the things that make you said, huh?
So I wrote the introduction last because it felt to me like a way of stitching together the essays. And when I wrote the introduction, I was surprised and reread the essays for the 10th time. I discovered that there's this really strong, at least I think, strong strain of optimism that runs through the essays. And, I'm in a fairly dark place about the state of things in this country. And I thought, boy, that my optimism surprises me. I am optimistic. I think the essay in the book that in a lot of ways to me epitomizes my thinking is there's an essay called Making the Circle Bigger. And actually it was a phrase by one of our students. It was kind of a plea they were doing this great work and bringing their community together in the South Bronx. And his plea was, okay, well, we're doing great work. How can we bring more people into this work and make our circle big? So the one thing I think of this circle as being this thing we use a lot in Outward Bound, and it's very egalitarian. Everybody occupies kind of the same place in the circle, regardless of your background or circumstance. But the other thing about the making the circle piece that feeds my optimism is this idea of in our circle, we need to include people, and Laurie talked about this, who don't necessarily look like us or think like us. So I hadn't been thinking in those terms. So if we can make our circle bigger and engage with who don't necessarily agree with us or come from different backgrounds, and this gets to the human spirit part of my title, and if we can tap into our common humanity and really emphasize the kinds of character traits or social emotional attributes like integrity and perseverance and compassion and empathy, maybe above all, then there's reason to be optimistic. But that was a surprise to me that I felt the level of optimism that I did. And I hope it's not naivete. But anyway, I feel there is strong strain of optimism that runs through the book.
The latest Superman movie said kindness is the new punk. So maybe optimism is the new punk, Richard. We've had this conversation maybe before where the question of where does energy come from in order to be resilient, in order to push forward, in order to create the forward motion that society deserves based on our founding documents. There's sometimes a cynicism, like we can't do anything, why try anything? And I like to think about the history and the arc of our nation and what it took to live up to the founding principles. And what it took was a lot of energy and it took a lot of suffering and it took a lot of folks who believed we could be more than what we are. So, yeah, I mean, I can appreciate this notion of optimism because if you don't believe, then how do you push?
I'm going to make a bit of a strange connection. There's an essay in the book about the golfer Rory McIlroy. I used his experience in winning a major tournament, the Masters, as a way of talking about this idea of success and failure and persistence. And there really is, again, such a strain in Outward Bound. It's about the effort that you're putting forward. You're not always going to be successful, and you're going to often learn more in your failure than you will in success. But it's about staying with it. It's the old 2 steps forward and 1 step back. And these days sometimes feels like 2 steps forward and 3 steps back. But you gotta keep at it.
And Richard, in your essay to start a school, you have a sentence that schools call upon us to recognizing that yearning is an integral part of the human condition.
Sure.
And the curiosity is also an innate human quality. And David, I think where this links to is, sometimes if you're depressed or demoralized, and let's, be real, there are actual mental health conditions that prevent this. But if you can have experiences of the joy that comes from helping another or the satisfaction that comes from accomplishing a difficult task, those things teach you that it is worth it. Whether the arc ends slowly or not at all, the getting up and doing something for your sister and fellow human beings feels good in and of itself and has value in and of itself. And so I think the pedagogy that we have is very much giving in the classroom and on a course challenges that feel difficult, whether that is hiking for 5 miles in the rain, or whether that is going for a week without your phone, or whether that is figuring out a science challenge in a different way and how to apply it. Like, once you get that sense of satisfaction of, I did it. I was walking through James Baldwin, one of our schools, and a student said to me, "Oh, you're the Outward Bound people. I did it. I survived my Jason experience." And she was
Wow.
talking about the lake and being scared for 3 nights that something was going to come get her. But this was like a long time later, years later, and she still had that sense of like, I did something I thought was going to be impossible.
Wait, Laurie, let me just push back on this idea. I feel like we should be sheltering kids from hard things to support their adaptive well-being, right? I feel like kids, when put in difficult situations, they suffer for them. They lose a sense of who they are. And if we're not scaffolding right, we're not putting the exact right supports, they're going to lose a sense of who they are. They're going to lose a sense of efficacy. I'm hearing you say that we should be supporting kids through productive struggle. Did I get that right?
You're absolutely right. And the scaffolding is really, really important, which is why the clarification of sometimes if you read Kurt Hahn in a particular way, it can just be like, you have to drive through. And that's why our
Drink water, drive
tagline is
on.
immersive, joyful learning. Our students are confronted with plenty of challenge in their life. It's not like their lives are challenge-free. What we're talking about is a challenge that with support and with determination, you can succeed at. And you can have that feeling of accomplishment, and you can have that feeling of joy. The joy that doesn't come from, a great packet of crisps or potato chips, but the joy that comes from, I remember in my previous job, I worked with women survivors of war, but she said it in a way that really resonated with me. She said, what I like about your organization, and Outward Bound is the same, is that you don't help us, you get us to help each other.
Mm.
And she said, that is more empowering than anything else, because when you've had choice taken away from you, the ability to help somebody else thrive, it gives you a sense of power. And so bringing the students into community, having them have that power of each other, the power within themselves, but with each other, is such a fundamental source of ongoing resilience that up against other challenges as well, ones that we wish they didn't have to confront.
And Dave, I really appreciate you're actually pushing back a little on this, because literally before joining this conversation, I was talking to somebody in Outward Bound about this notion of challenge. And I was pushing back a little to Laurie's point of, I don't think we can talk about challenge unless we pair it with support. David Brooks, New York Times columnist, had a phrase where he said, life is a daring adventure from a secure base. And we can't lose the secure base part of it. We need to provide our young people where they feel supported and they feel encouraged, where they can really spread their wings if they're going to rise to the kinds of challenges that they face in a school context or in, Laurie's point, in their lives. And then the other piece I wanted to pick up on that Laurie mentioned, it feels so important. And I know you and I have talked about this before. Part of the strength of Outward Bound, or the work that you do, is, well, we help young people to discover their own capability. We're not in the business of fixing young people. We're in the business of helping them discover their own strengths. That word discover feels so important to me. It's that it's there. They have greatness in them. And our job as educators, it's maybe the most important thing we can do, is to help them realize that there's greatness in them and help them unlock or activate that greatness.
Yeah, that's deeply inspiring to me. And I would imagine that a philosophy like this is super progressive. So probably started in the last 10 to 15 years. Is that right? Or is it Outward Bound as a philosophy relatively new in the educational context?
Again, it kind of goes back to Kurt Hahn's work in the 30s.
1930s.
Yeah, there are a lot of independent schools that have, philosophies that are very congruent with outward bound. It's a funny thing. The word progressive, I think, in some ways, the outward bound's approach is probably progressive, and in other ways, it's very traditional. The emphasis on character, for example, is it's not so progressive. I don't know what I would call it. So it's a melding of different approaches.
I mean, it depends on your baseline. To focus on character in 2025 may be a shift in educational philosophy.
Well, actually, I think it's universal. You could call it progressive, you could call it conservative. Believing in human potential is universal. I think different people have different ideas of how to unlock it, but the belief, and of course, there are forces such as racism that believe erroneously that some people have different potentials. But the belief that we want our students, or we want our children to do well, we want them to succeed, we want them to be happy. I have found that everywhere I've been in the world and everyone I've spoken to, it's a universal core value, I believe. And so I do think that wanting our children to have joyful, equitable experiences can be across a political perspective. And I also think it goes back before the 30s. I spent 20 years working in 44 different countries on the African continent, and a deep part of philosophy there is known as Ubuntu. And it says, I am because we are. And as someone who was raised overseas, but in American schools with that deep individualism, it took me about a decade to get it. I am because we are. How we treat each other is fundamentally who I am, is how I treat you. And we are. Like, that goes back to indigenous philosophy. I was reading this morning about character and indigenous knowledge systems. And the value of interdependence and community goes back thousands of years. And so the values that Outward Bound is promoting, which has been called character development, is as linked to indigenous knowledge systems and to Ubuntu as it is to European philosophies in the 30s, because these are universal values, or values, I guess I would hope would be universal. We value each other, we value our planet, and we believe in giving our children opportunities.
I want to just very briefly mention that, just to Laurie's point, there was one essay, I think it's the To Start a School essay in the book, where I talk about how I invoke someone you and I both know well, Ron Berger. And in the context of this idea that we've all gotten pushback on this idea that values get incorporated in schooling, and certainly heard from parents and others, it's not the job of schools to be inculcating values. That's the job of parents and community. But Ron's point, which speaks to Laurie's point about universal values, is that when you really engage with parents and the community, and you talk about the values we're referencing that have to do with honesty and integrity and compassion and empathy, they are universal, and everybody wants their kids to be living those values and exhibiting those behaviors.
Yeah, I appreciate the point, because I think we're in a difficult time in our educational system where the question of values has really been elevated, the question of what we value, how we express our values. And having had this conversation with Ron and seeing some of the conversations we're having here, one of the questions I think that is pushing the education system to a reckoning is what type of values should be universal and how students are developed in those spaces. So parent versus public institutions versus independent institutions, government schools versus the common good. In your book, it feels like you come down really specifically on this notion that it is okay for young people to learn about things that allow them to be members of our community. But I do want to throw this back to you, Richard, that it doesn't seem like there is a consensus on those values in 2025. How do we get to a better consensus around what it means to be a strong character in 2025 and the role of public schools in that?
My experience is that when you really do engage people on what are the things that you value and you want for your children, there is consensus. There isn't consensus for sure in our political discourse, but if you're willing to engage a school community, for example, or almost in every instance, the schools that we've worked with develop a series of, and the language has changed over time, but the character traits that they're most trying to develop and have their students practice. And those aren't developed in a vacuum. Those are developed in conversation with students and educators and parents in the school community. You come to some agreement, and usually they're the same. That some of the language may change. Open-mindedness in one school might be curiosity in another school. If you're willing to engage in the conversation about what is it that you really value and want your children to exhibit in their lives, their family lives, their community lives, in the workplace, I do think you come to some level of consensus.
Mm.
But, we are challenged as a society right now in our ability to engage with one another.
Yeah. Laurie, where you at with that?
Well, I think, because of the way public discourse is going, the increase in violence, but also, the opportunity and threat of artificial intelligence, the role of educators has always been to help students learn how to critically think, in my view. And that's more and more important. How do you triangulate? How do you critically analyze? How do you verify? How do you interrogate information that is given to you? And how do you do so? What comes up is in a loving way. The pace of change is so rapid. That's another reason I am so privileged to work with young people right now, is the world that we are living in today is so radically different than the one from 5 years ago, never mind 50 years ago.
No cap, Laurie, no cap. That's the reason why you work with young people, so you get all the cool slang and cool technology, bro.
I don't know what kids
Big
are like.
seven,
Do not say that, Mom. No. To learn how to learn, to learn how to think, to learn how to critically analyze, to learn how to be with other people, those are the critical skills we need, not, to memorize this, that, or the other. History is contested, and you have to learn how to analyze it. And so those thinking skills, and, as Richard says in his book, curiosity, critical thinking skills, basic skills, of course, numeracy and writing, and let's not downplay basic literacy skills. We have to do right by our students by getting those basics. But the higher order of being able to critically engage, that's what we need for all kinds of reasons right now. The rapid pace of change, the advent of the AI, the change in the way public discourse is disintegrating, and the need to figure out really tough solutions. Leadership is about making decisions where there's no right answer. And so it's about figuring out, what are we going to agree to do together when there isn't necessarily a right answer. And those are the skills that a New York City Outward Bound school and an urban assembly school are committed to providing for students in our communities.
Yeah, I appreciate that, Laurie. I think, for the record, having been doing character education for my own children for 11 years, maybe 10 years, because they were like 2. I do think there is a space to find consensus. And I think it's hard to create that space because we are strained when it comes to listening and it comes to communicating. And unfortunately, there is a consensus that is related to compromise. And I think we've just struggled to create that idea that compromise is what we can do for the common good. So yeah, I ultimately, Richard and Laurie, agree that when you listen deeply, folks want to develop young people that can do certain things for themselves and for the community. But I do worry. I've read Empathy is a Trojan horse for DEI, that the development of open-mindedness is a way to indoctrinate children. I do worry that we are coming to a place where folks are willing to not develop our children to prove a point.
There's a reason to worry. I would kind of return us a little bit to this notion of crew.
Yeah.
I do think, again, if like both the crew structure and the crew ethos is a place for young people to practice skills of really listening. When I go into schools and I listen to our students talk to each other, they're so facile at doing things like, let me build on this idea. And because they have a chance to practice it. And they are, Laurie said this very eloquently before, this idea of being in community with each other and being responsible for each other does provide some place where, again, I'm hopeful that young people who are exposed to this kind of crew structure and ethos will be in a much better position than we as adults are to be able to have conversations where they find common ground.
I'm hearing you say, Richard, that by giving young people the opportunity to learn and practice certain skills around listening and dialogue, they can actually get better at that. Did I get that right?
Totally. Yeah.
All right.
And it goes back to your point, David, about challenge and support. Like, even though I came to New York City Outward Bound Schools because I believed in the pedagogy, I was astonished in my first week when I went out on course and I saw how the instructors on this multiple day adventure in the out of doors would huddle because the students were having difficulty with the task and they were being asked to lead and they were being asked to collectively decide who's going to be at the front and who's going to do this and who's going to cook the meal, and they were being given responsibility and they were challenged by that. And the instructors, and there's a high ratio of instructor to students that may not seem efficient, but what it allows is for two instructors to huddle with a teacher as well and say, what is the best way to serve these students in this moment? What is the stretch that is doable? And what exercise can we give them? And so it's not going camping. It's not going on a hike. It is things like taking 60 kids on a hike in which no one is allowed to get to the top without the others and getting that group all committed to it. So it's extreme. It takes very, very talented facilitation. And I was blown away by the quality of the instructors on course in the outdoors as I was with the instruction in class because of the level of emotional intelligence it required, and also to be pushed back. Like, people are getting misgendered, people using language that other people don't like or don't feel comfortable with, and holding that safe space throughout all that complexity, sometimes in the pouring rain and in challenging environments. It requires skill. So you don't just throw people in, you give them a container in which the challenge and the space for belonging is supported by people who know how to do that.
It's almost like you're saying that by focusing on the social and emotional dimensions of learning, that students can develop those skills and apply them to the real world. Did I catch on that?
Something you know something about, yes.
A little bit, a little bit.
That's why we're partners in this work.
I believe very deeply in that. I think you're saying important aspects of development, right? And you continue to focus on this notion of what the whole child needs to be in community with each other, not only in school, but outside of school. And as you mentioned, Laura, this is a long trend in education, everything from indigenous forms of knowledge to inspired by horrific events, but all focused on who our kids are as much as what they know. So, Rich, I'm going to give you the last word on this. I want to talk about educational trends. I want to talk about your book, and I want to talk about what readers should take away from your book that will outlast the moment that we're in and maybe even help improve it.
Some of what I hope outlasts the movement. One thing that leaps to mind is something that you are an amazing champion of. This idea of when you think about education, it's the melding together of social emotional learning and academic learning. And it's really hard to tease the two apart. This idea of a whole child approach to education, they're inextricably linked, those two things. So I hope that comes through loud and clear in the book. I'm hardly the first person to make that point. I hope people carry that forward. I hope that this idea of student voice and student agency and, going back to Kurt Hahn quote about, the ship of state being wrecked. Our kids are so capable. One of the things that I found to be the case in too many schools, are hopefully not our schools or the UA school, is that you have teachers who say that they believe that all kids can achieve great things, but they don't really believe it in their heart of hearts, and it shows through. So I hope that one of the things that comes through in the book is, it may be the most important things, is the belief system that we need to carry into our work with young people. If we don't have faith in them, who will? And they deserve our faith. And we need to demonstrate it all the time in our work with young people. It's sincerely that believe in, like I say, the potential and greatness of every young person. And then I do hope that, the crew not passengers idea, I hope is sticky. I hope that people, when they encounter it, they grasp it both as something that should be very present in the culture of every school, and also, as I said before, something that could serve our country as a way of thinking about how we live in relationship to one another, in community to one another, where there's an interdependency and this really obligation that we have to look after and take care of one another.
Mm. And Richard, before we close this episode, let's get the title of your book one more time and where folks can get it if they would like to purchase it.
The book title is Inward and Outward, Reflections on Education, Democracy, and the Human Spirit. And it is available on Amazon. It's available at Barnes & Noble and wherever people order books these days.
Well, Richard, former CEO of Outward Bound, New York City Outward Bound, Laurie Adams, current CEO of New York City Outward Bound, focusing on this notion of crew, not passengers, focusing on this notion of interdependence, of who our children are as much as what they know, and reflections on our education system, our democracy, and who we want to be in community. It's been a pleasure to have you on the show, and best of luck.
Thank you, David.
Thank you so much, David.
Thanks for listening to our latest episode of Innovations in Education, where we bring education leaders who have made things work in the education sector. If you like this episode, please subscribe so that you can hear more great content around innovations in education. I've been your host, David Adams, and have a great day.